Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Institute of Canada, this is Mark Rippon, HRAI Technical Advisor. I'd like to welcome you today to today's session, which is the first in a joint venture between HRAI and TSSA. It's a webinar series titled Know Your Gas Code, B149.1, Interpretations and Explanations by TSSA. Today's presenter is John Marshall, Director, Fuel Safety Program with the Technical Standards and Safety Authority. In this first session, John will address some of the most common fuels non-compliances as per TSSA data. Please be advised, all the lines are now currently muted. You'll notice on the control panel of your screen, there is a link to ask questions. You may ask questions at any time during the webinar. We've allowed time at the end of the presentation to address the questions we received. And a copy of this presentation can be accessed from the handout section on your control panel, and a recording of the webinar will be sent to you following the session. We'll now turn things over to John Marshall. Welcome, John.
Welcome. Thank you, Mark. Yeah, I appreciate that introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. And also, I'd like to extend my welcome to you. And just for those of you who perhaps don't know me, I am the Director of Fuel Safety. I've been with TSSA for 13 years. And however, I have been in the business for nearly 50 years now. So I've pretty much worked in all aspects of the business, from sales and service, maintenance, and technical heating and engineering. And just I have chaired the code committees in the past and the technical committees. And just as a bit of trivia for those, that I actually did start in this business as a contractor many years ago. So this is our agenda for today, and so I'll go through the purpose of the webinar series and some of the background information. And then, as Mark said, I'd like to take you through the top 10 or most common non-compliances that we see, and I'll provide some clarifications at the end. But before I start, I'd just like to do a bit of a shout out to an old friend of mine, Barry Bowman. A lot of you probably know Barry, and Barry and I served on the code committees for many years, and he's probably been around as long as I have. And so really this was Barry's idea some time back to put together this kind of a webinar series. And so he had conversations with Martin, and Martin and I and Mark have been discussing it for a while. And so today is a result of that. So if you're out there listening, Barry, thank you for this, and appreciate the the suggestion. So, as said, this is a joint venture between HRAI and TSSA. And it's really intended to provide some clarity on issues and code requirements, but also drive consistency and increase compliance across the whole fuel sector. And then also to provide a forum for us to have some dialogue and conversation as we go forward on various issues. So let's move right along. And so today we're going to look at those top 10 non-compliances and the things that we see in our travels. And so I'll present the issue, provide some clarification and or examples that might help illustrate the issue better. And just to say that, this is a snapshot of information that I pulled at the time that I prepared the presentation. And I'd also like to take questions at the end so we can get through all of the non-compliances, okay? So before we start, I just wanted to say that when things go badly or safety procedures aren't followed, the results can be catastrophic. So here you see an example of what used to be a private dwelling in Mississauga. You can see the widespread damage, but it wasn't only to this house, but also the surrounding buildings, and some residents were months getting back into their homes. In fact, in this particular incident, 12 neighbors were injured and over 800 homes were damaged in this explosion. So you can see that the importance of our safety work in Ontario. So moving on to the first issue, which is identification and support. Here you'll see example of poor support, and I could also use this as an example of a corrosion concern. But this is our 10th most common non-compliance. And so what I'm going to do here with this format is I'll put the code or the regulatory requirement to the left, clarification below, and then if I have an illustration to help address it better, it'll be on the right. So So in this case, the the natural gas code requires that piping or tubing shall not be supported by other piping or tubing and shall not be installed with individual supports of sufficient strength and quality. And so there are tables in the code for spacing and that kind of thing. But the emphasis here, or the clarification, is that you have to use proper supports. Ropes, twist ties, and things of that nature are just not acceptable. They must be metallic and meet the the temperature requirements. But also, you can't support it with other pipes and ductwork as well. So moving on to our ninth most common, has to do with identification. And the natural gas and propane installation code, every care, detention, occupancy, commercial, industrial, assembly building, the piping and tubing needs to be identified. And there are several manners of doing that. So here you can see a good example of where a piping has been painted, but also has been labeled with an appropriate label to indicate that it's a natural gas. And so the clarification is somewhat self-evident, but I can tell you in our travels that this painting is not always done in accordance with the code, and it's certainly important to do that when you get into these types of buildings. The next area we'll look at is piping and corrosion protection, and in this particular section, I'll look at the painting, corrosion, and the bonding issues with respect to piping. And I'm going to start with the bonding issue. Natural gas and propane installation code, all interior metal gas piping and tubing that may be energized shall be electrically continuous and shall be bonded in accordance with the Ontario Electrical Safety Code. And so the intent here is that we don't want people to be faced with shock hazard inadvertently or otherwise, having incidental contact with live piping that might have been energized. And so there are guidelines out there, one of those being the ESA Bulletin 10-14-8, the equipotential bonding of non-electrical equipment. Now, this bulletin is out there, but it is currently under review. There was a bit of a conflict in with the corrugated stainless steel manufacturer's instructions. And so depending on what you're working with, if you're working with CSST, you have to follow that manufacturer's instructions for now in terms of the bonding. For rigid pipe, it's okay to follow the electrical safety bulletin, but that one is under review, and I'm not quite sure when we'll see a new version of that come out, but just be aware of that. So what I'm going to show you now, this is just one example of how you can accomplish the bonding, and it's the use of the water piping system. So I would caution you that given the common use of non-metallic water piping systems, it's important to verify that the cold water piping is electrically continuous and is connected to an electrical system equipment in order to use this. So the thing you need to be aware of is that if people are making repairs or using some of the newer insulated fittings or the plastic fittings that may disrupt the continuity, and you run into that kind of a situation, then you're going to have to put some kind of a bonding jumper wire around that. But please be cautious that just don't assume that piping is continuous all the way back to a good solid ground. Another example of how you can accomplish this is with a situation where you've got a direct conductive connection of the gas piping to the gas-fired equipment that is also supplied by an electrical circuit with a bonding connector, and it will meet this requirement. And again, the caution that ensure that there's no insulated fittings or some break in that metal conductivity that would cause the bonding to fail. So looking at at painting and corrosion, there's kind of the good and bad examples here on the left. A good paint job that protects the piping. The one on the left, bit of a the not so good. It's the piping that requires some painting and or coating to protect it from corrosion. So this is our seventh most common or non-compliance. Outdoor piping or indoor piping and tubing that is exposed to atmospheres that are corrosive to the piping or the tubing shall be protected by either painting or coating. This one's somewhat self-evident in that, if you've got, bare steel outside or in a corrosive atmosphere, that you need to paint that and or properly coat it. The next area we'll take a look at is pressure test tags. There are two requirements here in terms of tags. One's the initial installation, and the other one would be replacements. The sample on the left is just that. It's a copy of the pressure test tags that are available out there that you can use. Doesn't have to be the only one. But this is our sixth most common non-compliance, and so the code says the person required to perform the pressure test rather, generally the installer, has to follow these requirements and complete the tag. The important part here is that what I should say is there is an exemption within the code if you're a certificate holder working for an employer who's not required to be registered as a contractor. Then you could be exempt from one part of filling out that pressure test tag, i.e. you can just put an NA, or it requires the contractor registration or the name and number there. So, but what I would ask is that these have to be filled out totally, and please make them legible. Many times we get into these situations and it's very hard to read the name and that, but so if you're trying to remain anonymous, you won't, because we will track you down. So moving on to some installation issues, in terms of safe installations, I guess, ensuring that when we leave, the installation is both complete and safe. I can tell you in many instances where TSSA is attended, we find safety deficiencies, or if we're attending an incident, and the excuse was, well, I wasn't finished. Well, if you weren't finished, then the appliance shouldn't have been activated until it was finished and it was safe to operate. And that is regardless of what anybody will tell you. And I'll give you an example that we recently were involved in a carbon monoxide incident where exactly what happened, that the installation really wasn't completed and really shouldn't have been turned on, but the installer was pressured by the general contractor and or the building owner. They needed heat or hot water, and they were pressured, and they relented and turned it on, and we had a CO incident. So it is your responsibility to ensure safety when you leave that installation. So our fifth most common has to do with, before you're leaving installations, installers shall ensure that the appliance, accessory, component, or equipment, piping or tubing they install complies with the code, and that the person initially activating the appliance shall ensure that the appliance is in safe working order. There are no exceptions here. You must ensure that it's safe before you leave. And we find things like missing supports and venting materials that are incorrect, or they're mismatched materials, or they used the wrong glue. And again, combustion air that isn't sufficient for the installation, or there isn't proper clearances to, the vent materials, or the appliance itself in terms of being able to service it. So we'll take a look at a couple of examples here that I pulled out. And this first one is somewhat subtle, I guess, and you really could miss it. But what I want to draw your attention to is that this is an indication of a possible problem. And so if you note the melted blue grommet in the picture down just below, that's a drafted off of an appliance, I think probably a water heater. And so that could be an indicator of a downdraft or a spillage situation, and worthy of either a smoke test or a match test to make sure that that appliance actually is drawing. And so, as I said, somewhat subtle, but can be an indicator of a potential problem, and you would be doing your client a good service if you did perform that check for them. This is another example of clearly where we've got some chimney issues here. And you can see that, the whole base of that chimney is full of debris and that. And so those kind of situations, like pull out your mirror and take a look, or pull the vent connector up a little higher up the chimney and have a look up there and see what that situation is. And if you've got situations where, you get some deterioration, then point that out to the customer, and probably in all cases, you're going to need to tag it. This next one, this one's a great bird's nest, but I can tell you it doesn't help the venting action one little bit. And this is actually something we came across some time back now, but it's a good illustration of what can happen when the wildlife can kind of take over your venting system. So this next area we're going to move into is more of a general area, and I would say that 3.3.1, it's actually a reg reference here, and it's more general in nature. But it has sections with the duty to maintain, and also it deals with installation issues. And so our fourth most common non-compliance is an appliance, accessory, or component or other equipment shall be installed in accordance with the manufacturer's certified instructions and this code. So it's a general requirement, but if there is a conflict, the most stringent one applies. So if you, for example, have a clearance to combustibles, for instance, that says one says 6 inches and one might say 1 or 2 inches, then you have to go with the more stringent requirement. And again, we see issues around improper venting materials, or the wrong glue used to put vents together. With the advent of the plastic vents over these years, we've seen a lot of issues with mismatching materials and glues and that kind of thing, or no glue at all. And also, like I said, clearances and ensuring that the appliance has a proper base. And so I don't have a picture today, but I have one that I use where a water heater is sitting up on blocks, and it's just not acceptable to be a proper base for a fuel-fired appliance. Our third most common non-compliance is the duty to maintain in a safe operating condition. So an owner or a user of an appliance, equipment, or work or other thing employed in the handling or the use of gas shall ensure the appliance, equipment, or work or thing employed in handling the use of the gas is maintained in a safe operating condition. So this, I can tell you that from TSSA's perspective, there were 270 occurrences of carbon monoxide in private dwellings in 2019 already. And that CO accounts for over 50% of all the fuel-related occurrences that we see. And in Ontario, over 65% of all the deaths and injuries due to CO occur in homes. So you can see the importance of this. So lack or improper maintenance is the leading cause of CO. And I admit it's an owner-user responsibility, but we can assist our customers and our clients. Inform them when maintenance is required, remind them of the CO alarm requirements. It's interesting that CO alarms have been mandatory in the province of Ontario for some years now, and yet the amount of homes that we go into where they're not active or they're just not there. So certainly from TSSA's perspective and any of the work we do with any of our safety partners is that regular inspection and maintenance is the key safety message. And so if you're seeing, fuel-fired appliances that need maintenance, if you're not allowed to service it at a time, tag it and make sure that your clients are aware that it needs service, because invariably when we look at incidents, and especially involving carbon monoxide, maintenance is one of the key things that we come across that just is not being done properly or not being done at all. The second most common non-compliance that we come across, again, general in nature, is a general requirement for compliance that every person engaged in an activity, use of equipment, or process or procedure to which the act and the reg shall apply, or regulation applies, shall comply with the act and the regs. So activity includes installation, service, purging, removal, repair, modifying, using, maintaining. Pretty much if you touch it, you're responsible for it. And when I say that, I mean you're responsible when you leave to make sure it's either safe to operate or you shut it off, or it's either compliant, and if it's not, you have to tag it. You have to red tag it, inform your customers that there's things to be done, especially if they're not going to allow you to kind of make that repair on the spot. But if you're not repairing it then and there, then you need to tag it and follow that process that we have in place. This is an example of venting that we came across, and you can see clearly there that the cross-sectional area of that vent connector has been severely compromised, where they just stuck it through a looks like a return air there and sliced into the vent connector, and certainly affected the venting of that appliance. So the one of the most prevalent, I guess, orders written by TSSA has to do with unacceptable conditions. And so this is for the non-immediate hazards, or the B warning tags that are there, and the regulatory responsibility that goes around that. And so all certificate holders and ROTs do have a regulatory responsibility in this area, and I will, Mark and I have been talking about that, and we will expand on this particular area in our next webinar, where we'll talk about the roles and responsibilities of certificate holders and contractors. But this is I guess one of our most prevalent ones that we come across, where the tags aren't being written and the customers are not being advised that there are non-compliances or potentially some safety issues out there. And so this particular requirement from the regulation, so this wording is out of the 212, which is the natural gas regulation, but the wording is similar in the 211 or like the propane or the fuel oil, and also 217, which is petroleum. So the wording is similar in all of them. The requirement is pretty much the same. Unacceptable conditions where there's no immediate hazard. The holder of a certificate or an ROT finds that a appliance or work is in an unacceptable condition, but that does not constitute an immediate hazard. He or she shall immediately give oral notice of the condition to the distributor who supplies the gas to the appliance. Immediately give written notice to the user of the appliance describing the condition and advising that the notice of the condition has been given to the distributor. So it's very clear here. This is a sample of a warning tag that's out there, and it happens to be one of ours. But again, doesn't have to be this tag. I mean, you certainly can have your own. I think what we're looking for is to capture essential information in there, and but it doesn't necessarily have to be that particular tag. So this next slide is an example of a tag that really helps know it. There's not sufficient information here to know what the problem is. And so I rewrote this tag just to kind of maintain the privacy, but it is an actual tag, and it just says venting not to code reference 452, and then it has the information down below. So the problem is that the code reference is not for venting, it's for suitability of use. And there's not enough specific wording there as to what's actually wrong. And so it really helps no one. So you'll remember in my previous slide that, it says, give written notice describing the condition. So if it's worthy of a tag, put the information on that tag so that it helps, because I can tell you, and something like this, I'm going to get the call because they see TSSA's logo up there, and I have no clue what the problem is with this particular situation. And so the venting section 8 of the code, is huge. And so to say venting to the code is just not sufficient information, and we're not providing good service to our customers or the regulatory environment whatsoever. So please give us as much information as you can, and fill those out, because it will go a long way to helping everybody. If you're not the one doing the repair and they choose to hire somebody else, they're not going to know what to do in this particular situation. So there you have it. That's TSSA's top 10 non-compliances that we're seeing. Would be happy to answer any questions that I can. If I can't have the answer today, certainly I will undertake to get back to you, and I guess we can include that as part of the webinar materials that we'll supply to you later.
Absolutely.
So we have a question that says, how come you don't show breakdown of billable hours, including timestamps, the 180 prepaid credits applied to those billable hours? In other words, a more itemized breakdown of the fees you charge on an audit. So I guess if you're looking for the fees for an audit are embedded into the renewal, the registration renewal. I thought they were separated out. I can check that though. I thought there was a separate line item for the registration renewal and the 1/3 of the audit fee that will happen after 3 years. I will double check that. I thought that was there, but in terms of if the other part then is that there will be another component could be that if we go over the 3 1/4 hours on the audit, then there could be extra bill. I'll do a review of that the invoicing and make sure that I'm pretty sure those line items are there, but I'll double check it. There's a point there. It says back up. You're saying that the electrical ground used in the 120 VAC connection at the panel is considered bonded. That is my understanding. That, well, you have to look and see that the connector is. I mean, if it's a 2-wire, then be careful. But if it's something that's has the bonding wire in it and back to the panel, it should provide a good bonding.
Are you going to?
Oh, sorry. Sorry. I think I missed a question there. So, are you going to schedule a webinar about the new changes to the B149 gas code? Certainly, we will either have a webinar or we might even do a wider workshop when we get to the code adoption. The codes are due to be published sometime in January. And so TSSA's process for that, for code adoption, is that in this case, we would pull the risk reduction group together that's led by Merrick, and that meeting would be dedicated to going over the code changes and or things that will become part of the code adoption document that might have some variation to what the national code says. So there will be some form of update provided when the new codes are adopted, for sure. They didn't describe the problem on the red pay because there were not enough room on the pay to make the description. Fair enough, but I'll give you that there's not a whole lot of room there, but I think too that you'd have to agree that to say the venting's not the code is not sufficient either. So if proper reference to the code and that clause would help, but for example, say in inappropriate materials or the wrong glue, or the vent material wasn't glued, something that I get it, you only got a couple lines there, but there's got to be a little more specifics you can put in there to kind of help everybody out. Next question. Called in to address a furnace and notice an issue with the hot water tank.
Customer says you weren't asked to look at the water heater.
Okay, so I was actually going to address this in my next webinar, but so here's my expectation of what would happen in this situation. I don't expect a certificate holder to wander the building or wander around a house looking for every piece of equipment and thing there is. What I do expect is that if you're working on the furnace and the water heater sitting next to it and you see something, my expectation is that you would address that in some manner, either repair, tag it, whatever. And I get that the clients, and I get these calls, they say, well, he wasn't called in to look at the water heater and he tagged me for it. And I said, he's doing his safety performance and doing what he's supposed to. There are some things that you need to look at, and if they're adjacent to what you're working on, and I would also add to that, if there's indicators of venting issues, that you should be looking at the chimney as a matter of your safety procedures. So, but yes, that's the expectation that you should look at stuff that is within your eyesight when you're working.
The suggestion is to make the red tags bigger with larger areas for description.
Okay, we can take that away and consider that. You're right. Like I said, again, I would say that, you know, the warning tag samples that are out there are samples, and absolutely, if you choose to design one of your own that has a larger note area, absolutely go for it. I think what we're looking for is to capture essential information as opposed to, you know, following that strict sample that TSSA has. We're just trying to keep them of a size that kind of fit in your pocket or your toolbox.
The next question is, what are the manufacturer's requirements to fulfill in the installation instructions regarding the sequence of operations, etc.?
So if we're talking about commissioning here, and I'll make an assumption that usually the manufacturer certified instructions have information or essential things that you need to do for commissioning an appliance, and those should be followed, and because they know their equipment best, and so in all cases refer to the manufacturer if in doubt, because they should be able to provide you with the information to know how to carry that out. Certainly from TSSA's perspective, you know, we can't know everyone's manufacturers, and so if you're installing a piece of equipment, generally those instructions should be with you and or in the box anyway, so you should be able to refer to those.
The next question, I believe, has already been answered. It's, can you please explain what products you are responsible for when working on a furnace in a house? Are you responsible for all gas appliances or just the furnace?
Okay, so I think Mark's right. We didn't answer that one.
The next one is more of a housekeeping piece. Will you be sending out copies of this webinar to people who have attended? Yes, we will. We'll cover that at the end of the webinar. Can we get a copy or download the presentation? Yes, you will have access to that. Absolutely. Several different mechanisms for obtaining that. And then the next one is, as mentioned at the meeting last night, can you please mention where the webinar will be kept for future reference or for someone who could not participate in this webinar? Yes, the webinar is being recorded and will be stored at both TSSA and HRAI on their websites in a library, webinar library, and that will be available to any and all people interested.
So Phil, what I would say to you, Phil, if you have an example, it might be easier, not that I'm trying to skirt it, but if you can send me an example and we can take this one offline, I'd be happy to walk through it and see exactly what you mean and take a look at an invoice. So if you can do that, feel free to send me an email at jmarshall@tssa.org, and I'll be happy to take a look at that.
Okay. In regards to pressure test tag, make sure the municipality is in the portion where the address is located. Main Street is found in almost all municipalities, so if you don't provide the city or jurisdiction, it's going to be pretty hard for anybody to follow up on that.
Good point. Thanks, Charlie.
Just wondering about the bonding requirement. As stated, it needs to be of a sufficient size for gauge wire as per the B149. Would a 120 volt AC line be okay to use, say for instance, on a furnace?
Corey, I would kind of refer you back to perhaps the bulletin. I'm not sure if it's a little more detailed in the electrical, but it's more of an electrical question. I'm thinking that the standard wire from a furnace for 120 back to the panel will have a grounding wire in it, but I can't say 100% for sure if that would. It certainly wouldn't be a 6 gauge on a 14-2 wire, so I don't think,
No, I believe that would need to be redirected to ESA, but our understanding currently is if the appliance requires electrical service, such as your furnace, and it is connected to the panel through Romex, what have you, then it would typically be considered to be bonded. The 6-gauge wire is for linking any unbonded portions of the gas line. But that should be confirmed with ESA. Is there another question down below that, Sonia?
That's the one.
We've already done that.
You missed this one.
Oh. In the case of existing field approval, can the service contractor review the documentation submitted by the original installer? Who can I contact at TSSA? Yeah, I guess the client will have all of that documentation and should be there. There's no reason that we can't review that. Certainly, we send it out to the applicant and or the owner or user of the particular equipment. And so I would suggest that you contact the user owner in case that there is private information in there that we wouldn't necessarily share with somebody else. I think we kind of just went over that one about the number 6 wire on bonding.
So what is the difference between the B149.1 and B149.3 in industrial facilities as it relates to fire heaters?
Okay, so the B149 is the .1 is the natural gas and propane installation code, generally used for the piping, tubing, venting, but also for certified and approved appliances. The B149.3 is a field approval code used when you've got one-offs or uncertified equipment or equipment that needs to be approved by TSSA because there are of a specific type that doesn't warrant like a line of furnaces or a line of water heaters. So it's more individualized equipment or specialized equipment that are used that, there might be industrial ovens or equipment of that manner where it's just not in a manufacturer's interest to try and go through a certification program. And so the B149.3 is used in that for that.
The next question is regarding the verbal presentation, including questions and answers. Will that be saved somewhere for future reference? Yes or no? Absolutely. If supporting rigid pipe to a barbecue, would using the fence to support the piping be allowed?
If it's a permanent installation, that would be sufficient. But I mean, I would be leery of some less than substantial. You might want to take a look at whether it's worthy to have its own post or not. But certainly, if it's in good repair and that there's no reason you could use that to support it.
Okay. Yet another one on grounding. Is the electrical ground considered the bond? In which case, in a new home, the 120-volt AC wire from your panel contains the bond, or do you need a separate number 6 wire on that one? Pictured, you showed a panel, a disconnect, and a furnace. I believe the picture showed a panel, a furnace switch, and a furnace. Mm-hmm. So that would be continuous throughout, but you'd have to check and make sure the ground wire is actually present all the way through. Okay, sorry. New housing installations using all-round strapping hanging 1 foot from the ceiling. Would this be considered okay as pipe support? Plumber strap.
If it's metallic strapping and it's independently supported and screwed up to the floor joist, so there should be no reason you couldn't use that.
Will you be doing these webinars on a regular schedule?
Yes, we will. I think what we've planned now is to kind of our first season, I guess, is that we'll probably run until April with this series. Likely take a break over the summer and then come back in the fall with a new set of topics to present to you. So certainly we're looking at January, February, March, and April right now as being able to do some webinars this year.
Okay, if the manufacturer fails to provide proper installation instructions, how can the owner servicer formally address a deficiency?
Well, That first, you know, if you're asking the question, I guess you've had that happen to you. But manufacturers, the standards for a central furnace, for example, has requirements for what the manufacturer's installation instructions must contain, and so they are required by standard. So if you have an example where these aren't being sent out with the appliances, or they're or you consider them insufficient, absolutely, you could send a sample of those over to my technical desk at TSSA. We'd be happy to look into that and reach out to the manufacturer for clarification.
Okay, the next one is something of a statement. We find that in new housing, things are a disaster. Why is TSSA not checking on these buildings more often? Installation is inspected by the gas supplier, but many issues are found. It's so frustrating.
Okay, so when you look at the regulatory safety net within the province of Ontario, we all have a role to play. Okay, so the fuel distributor is responsible for the initial supply of gas. They're responsible for the initial installation to ensure that that appliance is code compliant and is safe to operate, and that's part of their final inspection for the new installs when the service is being activated for the first time. So they are responsible for that. TSSA doesn't do those kinds of inspections. We don't certainly, you know, we wouldn't be going into all the new construction sites and doing inspections. I can tell you that, you know, if issues come to our attention, we're happy to look into those. And so again, I would say, if you have an example with that you can give us that we can go and take a look at, then we'd be happy to do that.
What is the purpose of bonding?
So the purpose of bonding is to prevent people from getting shocked and killed. So if, you know, you know, occasionally you'll get connection on gas pipe and or appliances where they're not properly bonded. And basically the furnace casing or the gas piping is like a live conductor. And so if you touch that, you're likely to become the ground and you're gonna really feel it. And we come into this situations sometimes, you know, the bonding became an issue many years ago, but you know, with the use of insulated fittings and other things, the systems aren't necessarily continuously bonded, and so there's a need to have guidelines to do that.
The next question is, I'm a consulting engineer, and we do see existing installations that are perhaps lacking. Do we have a responsibility to flag bad installations, and how would we contact?
Well, the regulatory responsibilities are on certificate holders and authorization holders for sure. But what I would say is that as you know, professional engineers, I think we probably also have a duty, although perhaps not regulated by TSSA but you would have a duty to you know, point out unsafe conditions and report those at least to your customers so that they can follow up with somebody.
Mandatory maintenance for all gas-fired equipment, is that required annually?
I love this question. I wouldn't say that you know, I can't make it mandatory. I could, but you know, I've been down that road with the code committee, and certainly I would like to see equipment maintained annually. As you heard me in one of my earlier slides say, that the key safety message that we put out there, even ahead of CO alarms, is that regular inspection and maintenance is the key to safe operations. And we continue to say that, and that, you know, fuel-fired equipment should be maintained on a regular basis and inspected to ensure that it is safe to operate.
So we're getting down to the last few questions that we'll have time for. Do we as a contractor have a responsibility to assist the fuel supplier in the initial meter unlock and appliance inspection?
Not sure what you mean there. I think that, you know, we've had some conversation in other meetings about the commissioning and responsibilities. Certainly the fuel distributor does have the responsibility to ensure that the installation is safe, complete, and ready to go. And it's really incumbent upon them to how they satisfy themselves with that. So, you know, whether they're looking for a completion of a commissioning sheet by the installer, and if that's what you mean by assisting, yeah, I think that they're, you know, the fuel suppliers will not be, you know, kind of going through the startup checks that are required by the installer. And so you can help them by doing that and assisting with the turnout.
I'm not sure this one, next one may be something we want to address in a separate webinar, but could you please clarify venting practices for garage unit heaters using stainless steel material, residential and commercial applications for horizontal venting? There's major discrepancy between unit heater manufacturers' install guidelines.
That would be probably a bigger, more complicated issue for us to wrestle with in a situation like this. But again, I would say, Greg, if you have examples of that, I'm happy to, if you send them to us to the, you know, we'd be happy to look into those and answer that at a future time.
And then CSST, manufacturer instructions do not specifically ask for tape wrap to be applied when passing through exterior non-masonry walls. Does this material require to have an additional pipe wrap applied?
Again, I think I have to refer you back to the manufacturer's instructions because those piping systems are certified. And so if there's no requirement for the extra or the double wrap on that, then the manufacturer is going to say that the coating on that tubing is sufficient for the corrosion protection.
That's it. And the last question is thanks from Al. So Al, you're more than welcome. Thanks for joining us. So thank you, John, and thank you everybody online for joining us and sticking with us. Hope everybody's found the session to be informative. We very much appreciate your feedback and comments on today's presentation. It'll help us tweak everything and make sure that these are as meaningful to you as is possible. We'll also take suggestions for future topics. Please take a few minutes to complete the evaluation survey that will appear on your screen at the end of the webinar. That's our opportunity to collect this information. So this ends our presentation for today. We look forward to having you join us again on Thursday, January 30th, when our topic will be the roles and responsibilities of certificate holders and contractors. Thank you again, everybody. Thank you, John.
Thank you. Thank you, HRI, for hosting.
Look forward to seeing you next time.